Hello, everyone. My name is Mariette DiCristina, and I'm the Dean of Boston University's College of Communication. I'm also an alum and the parent of a recent BU grad. Thank you so much for joining today's discussion, How We Talk About the Climate Crisis. This session is being recorded and will be available later on BU's website and on COM's website and on its YouTube channel. When you have questions, and I hope you do, there'll be lots of time for them. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen rather than the chat function, which will be disabled. The threat posed by a warming planet and changing climate is often described as existential. Yet a large segment of Americans and their elected leaders remain unmoved to act. Is this a failure to communicate by scientists translating the data, by advocates framing the problem, or by journalists telling a compelling story? And if it is, how then should we talk about the climate crisis? We're super fortunate to have with us today an awesome group of experts to help us tackle these questions and others from different perspectives. Let's say hello to them now. Jessie Gallun is the Director of Communications and Climate Change at the Nature Conservancy. In this role, Jessie directs all global strategy and messaging on climate change matters. The Conservancy is a global environmental nonprofit with more than 1 million members and 400 staff scientists who are active in more than 70 countries and territories. Jessie graduated from COM in 2001. Welcome, Jessie. So glad to have you here.
Thank you, Mariette. It's great to be joining you guys today.
Thank you. Zuckoff is a reporter for the nonprofit Report for America Project and WCAI, the NPR affiliate for Cape Cod and the islands. Eve specializes in covering the human effects of climate change, and she graduated from COM in 2018. Hey there, Eve.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
So glad you're here. Thanks for joining. Now let's say hello to Jacqueline Patterson, who is Senior Director for the NAACP's Environmental and Climate Justice Program. Before her current post, Jacqueline co-founded Women of Color United and worked for Action Aid International and Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, among other positions. She graduated from Boston University's School of Education in 1990. I'm so glad you're here, Jacqueline. Thank you. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator, after which I'll pass over the virtual mic. Sarah Finney-Robinson is an adjunct clinical professor here at the College of Communication and a senior fellow at BU's Institute for Sustainable Energy. Sarah also is the founding director of the 51% Project, a research initiative to identify behavioral science principles for ambitious large-scale engagement to address climate change and related planetary health crises. Welcome, Sarah. Thank you so much for joining, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Mariette, and welcome everybody to this exciting conversation. And welcome especially to our esteemed panel and to everyone in the audience and who's going to be tuning in to the recording after this live session. I have a couple of questions today, and I hope that as I offer some preliminary remarks before we get going with the panel conversation, that you'll all take notes on any questions that pop into your mind. And if you decide that you'd like to ask them, please do use that chat Q&A because we hope we can get to every single one of them. I just woke up this morning and it was April 21st, 2021. And I thought, wow, this is an incredible time really to be alive, very historic. And I wanted to just offer a few thoughts on this moment now, and then hope to circle back to our topic at hand on how we communicate about the climate crisis. It occurs to me that things are very different than they were a year ago, certainly, or even arguably a day ago before we had the verdict from Minneapolis. And I'd like to take all of this into account, or at least make an attempt. Seems to me that today we've all had experience now with what a global emergency actually is. We've had the experience of the coronavirus pandemic, a planetary health crisis on an unprecedented scale. We've also had unpacked and on full display racism and Black Lives Matter, the rising completely horrific issues of justice and the imperative for anti-racism. And we're perhaps now confronting that systemic crisis in an unprecedented way, and the stakes are unbelievably high. There are inequities across the board. There's misinformation. Mariette just asked if our failure to engage many people to move and act and feel comfortable participating on solutions to the climate crisis, is that a failure of communication? I would argue, well, maybe, but it's also great success on the part of those who have promulgated so well misinformation and obfuscation, like so many squid ink displays all over the place for the past several decades. Some people have been very well organized, very well funded, and very successful in confusing us, and in many ways promoting the complacency that so confounds those of us who are concerned and alarmed and interested in solving the climate crisis. So on the science of global warming and planetary health, we have multiple emergencies there too. We're shattering records, crossing thresholds, approaching tipping points, according to the world's top scientists, many of them here at this university. Are we going to fix this hot mess? We really don't know. So we also do have solutions though. On climate change, we have technology and innovation, we have investment, we have markets moving. We need tens of trillions of dollars to mobilize now over the next year, 2 years, 10 years, in order to move from investing in a fossil fuel-based global economy, affecting just about everything that we do in terms of how we live, how we eat, how we move around, what the buildings are that we're in. So we also have a new president, and he's maneuvered us back into the center of the action. Tomorrow, he's going to announce that the United States intends to cut planet warming emissions nearly in half by the end of this decade. And this is a target that's just going to require us all to transform the way we drive, heat our homes, cool our homes, eat, manufacture goods, recycle, everything about it. So we're going to see lots of change, and lots of it's just going to happen, and it's going to be market driven, and there's going to be all kinds of cool new ways of doing it. As I like to say, my grandmother was not aware of the Wright brothers putting their plane together, but she sure did know when it was possible for her to get on a plane and go across the ocean and go to Paris, which she did. So we may not all be as fascinated as I am, and as I'm sure all of us on this call are, about the innovation and ingenuity and incredible mobilization that's behind this shift. The whole idea is, though, that's really come to the fore, and I think during the pandemic, and I'd love to know what the panelists think about this, and all of you, is that climate and health and environmental and racial justice are all connected, and that these giant systemic issues can and will actually be addressed via a bold, generational, call it unprecedented strategy that is also dealing with the incredible in-our-face emergency of COVID and the comprehensive recovery and restructuring that is the best way forward from this mess. So climate and equity are part of each and every decision that is made from the top of our federal government. That is brand new. We're going to hear more about that tomorrow. And one more thing before I really turn this conversation over to our intelligent and insightful panelists. I believe that something profound has happened and is happening in our lives, in our bones, in our culture. Every single one of us is affected by the situation we've lived through in the last year and are still living through. That's unprecedented too. I can't think of one person I know whose life hasn't been affected by this situation, if not upended. Some of us have made significant life changes, as if the sight of a real crisis in our faces, real suffering all around and all around the world, and death has provided an invitation for us to be aware of a new capacity for making decisions, for making bold, necessary choices at a new level, to realize that this is our one life to live. And this is the time to act. And if not us, then who? So there's been a great dynamic of responsibility and accountability that I think has risen up. And in the case of climate solutions, when people say, as they have for decades, oh, we can't fix that, it's too inconvenient, it's too much to do, it's too expensive, it's too big, too much change, you know, we like things the way they are. Well, guess what? The melting ice sheets don't care about that. And if we think this is expensive and inconvenient, just wait till we have, you know, double the amount of increased parts per million in our atmosphere, as the scientists warn that we will. And now we can see what it will take. We can see what the vaccine rollout effort takes. We can see what leadership is like. We can see how effective leadership can be. And we can see how effective misinformation can be. So how does all of this affect the climate conversation and the words that we use? Now that we do know what an unprecedented emergency is, because we've lived through it, how does that affect our thinking on this? And I'm so thrilled to be here to moderate this panel. I think our panel is just uniquely suited to this enormous question. You're all ambitious, accomplished, talented, you're great thinkers, and of course, you're great communicators. And so what do you think? What lessons and insights have you gleaned from the past year? However unformed they are, we'd love to hear them. What do you think? How does this affect your approach to communicating about climate change? What's your perception of the people who you usually do try to communicate with? Have they changed in any way? And please give us a little context on where you work and how you work. And I'd love to start with Jackie, please.
Okay.
There you go.
Thank you so much. So, yeah, I think about, I was on a panel a couple of months ago with fellow Benjamin, who's the mayor of Columbia, South Carolina, and he said something that stuck with me. And imagery is always something that helps with communication. But he said that COVID-19 has served as an X-ray machine to expose the broken bones of America's society.
Wow.
Yeah. And that really that really kind of tells the story of how the situation with COVID-19 has impacted the ways that we talk about this work, the willingness for folks to understand, or the ability for folks to understand the systemic roots of all of these crises that we find ourselves in, the racial awakening, the awakening awakening the racial uprising and awakening,
Yeah.
the economic crisis, COVID-19, and climate change, and the systemic underpinnings in terms of the corporatocracy, the reckless pursuit of wealth, the greed, and this notion of an inverse relationship between my well-being and I can't be well unless I'm oppressing someone else. Like this false narrative around scarcity, really, as opposed to the reality around abundance. And so that's that's that conversation is one that folks on the front lines of climate change and all of these other injustices have been having for a very long time. But now there's a bigger table of folks who are willing to recognize these systemic underpinnings. So that would be my kind of opening comment around it.
And Jackie, can you just help just tell the story a little bit of your work and how you got started doing this?
Sure, yeah. So my work, interestingly enough, in some ways, the trajectory and path of my work illustrates these interconnected systemic underpinnings. I started my work with doing as a special education teacher, and in Jamaica, one of the first things that I ended up doing was starting a group to teach parents who had 3-year-olds who were all hearing impaired, because a little over 3 years before, there had been a rubella outbreak in Jamaica, and as a result, there were all these women who had rubella, and then they had children who had hearing impairments, which is something I guess is just a known thing, a known tie. And that struck me from the very outset in terms of the fact that the MMR vaccine, measles, mumps, rubella, is just something we all take for granted here in the United States, and something that wasn't there. So when rubella came to the island, something I've never heard of anyone in the United States having, in my lifetime, and but yet it swept the island, and we have this whole population of 3-year-olds as a result. And again, just that one thing started to help make me ask them questions about the extreme disparities there. I would go to the tourist areas where it would just be opulence and riches and so forth. And yet so much of the island was, the nation was living in these abject, impoverished conditions. Started to understand the connections between kind of geopolitics and so forth. And so fast forward to today, recognizing the differences between communities of color, BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous people of color, and the wealthy folks in our wealthy white folks, particularly in our nation, and those disparities, and then also recognizing the difference between industrialized nations and nations in the global South. And so these disproportionate impacts of climate change on communities and nations in the global South, and who's holding the power, who's driving the advancement of climate change, and who's being impacted, is some of the work that we're working on. And then also with COVID-19, we're seeing where there it's a kind of a situation where, just like a disaster, everyone in a community can be impacted, but the people who are the most vulnerable are the most impacted. And with COVID-19, we have everyone kind of being impacted, but then we have the folks who have the luxury to stay at home, or the folks who are able to to have the vaccine, and then the folks who are part of the vaccine trials but yet haven't had one dose of the vaccine since it's come out. And so the work that we do as the NAACP is on working on these disparities, working with communities to mobilize, build power, raise their voice, and push for the changes that are reducing the advancement of climate change. So pushing on reducing harmful emissions, protecting and fence the Clean Air Act, advancing clean air ordinances, and then making sure that there's equity in the response to climate change, from the National Flood Insurance Program to how do we make sure that there's food security, to levee fortification around sea level rise, to how do we make sure that we're reconfiguring our economy to make sure that there is equity in how we advance the changes that we need. So whether it's changing the energy system so that we have an energy system that's focused on energy for all, versus the energy system and clean energy, versus the energy system that is focused on providing profits to a wealthy few. So that's the work in a big nutshell, but in some. So thank you for asking.
So, well, and thank you, because I think, we can almost see your fingerprint on what I tried to capture there. You've had a lot to do with helping us all understand these aspects. So, Eve, how about you?
Oh man, how do you follow that?
I have no idea, but I will say that I love your Twitter profile, which says that I think it says you're a climate change reporter, but you're fun at parties anyway.
Yes, that's right. I tried to capture that.
I'm not. So please go ahead and tell us where you work and where your head is at on all this.
Sure. So I'm a public radio reporter. I work for WCAI. It's the NPR station covering the Cape Islands of Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard and the south coast of Massachusetts. And we're an affiliate of WGBH. So if you hear me in Greater Boston, that kind of explains that piece of it. And my work is covering the human impacts of climate change. So it's great because sometimes I get to talk just with scientists about nerdy things and look at snapping shrimp in little cups in labs. And then other times I get to meet, I met with a 89-year-old woman the other day in her home to talk about how, frankly, as a senior, how climate change is something she thinks about, and how she feels vulnerable and resilient in these kind of different complicated ways. And I think Jackie got right to the heart of it, that what COVID has done is it's just sheared open any questions about how global crises will affect people of lesser means and people who are traditionally discriminated against. I mean, it any thought experiment you've had about, oh, 50 years from now, how is climate migration, how is climate change going to affect people? Like, we had a perfect little case study this year that when there's a global emergency, many people, because of their class, because of their race, because of how they present to the world, will be treated without what they deserve. And she said it so much better than me, so go back to what she said. And I think the one thing I would add is just, I think that what the pandemic has done for me as a climate change reporter is it's, on the one hand, created more language around crisis and emergency. We know what it looks like to all be, or nearly all be, on the same page about what's happening around us. But it's also actually made me more, I think, sensitive. Like, I think that sometimes climate change, as a climate change communicator, I just want to scream from the rooftops, like, this is happening and let me show you the ways. But with one crisis as big and terrible as COVID-19, I think it's made me reel it in a little bit, and or not on the forward facing front, but internally, just spend more time thinking about, there's only so much bandwidth that any one person has to deal with COVID-19 and police shootings of unarmed Black men and their children screaming in the background of their Zoom calls on a single day. And we have to be really intentional and decent about the way that we communicate yet another crisis, yet another emergency. So I think it's shaped my thinking that way, and it's not a fully formed thought yet, but I've given some thought to that.
That's a super good point, and maybe gets us into the whole idea of, we're all in this together, which I've heard as a, realization finally from just about every kind of person you can imagine. I know there's some people who don't espouse that view still, who don't get that, but maybe there are enough of us who do get it, who sincerely do feel that way, that, the solutions will come in collaborating and in tearing down silos and in increasing transparency and, offering, for example, open source access to solutions, even, if you're a business, your competitors, that sort of thing. So thank you very much. What about you, Jesse?
Like Eve, I certainly don't know if I can articulate this nearly as well as Jackie did.
Oh,
but,
1 minute. I see that I have a housekeeping request. Please all get closer to your microphones.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hopefully you can hear me. I come at it from a slightly different perspective from the other two panelists. I think Nature Conservancy, as the world's largest conservation organization with a footprint in all 50 states and over 70 countries, we obviously are very, very focused on the people engagement and having those on the ground conversations and advocacy for those frontline communities that are so directly impacted. But we also have a major role to play with national level governments, major multinational corporations, multinational funding agencies, et cetera, that are the, for lack of a better term, the ones who have the power to create the landscape level change we're going to need to see for the type of future that we're all, praying and hoping for and working towards. So from what COVID, I think, has shown us at TNC over the past year plus is actually a counter to the point you made in your opening, Sarah. Sometimes you feel like we can't do this and we can't fix this. The past year has shown us that the behavior change required for literally transformational new activity is possible. We saw a 7% emissions reduction in global carbon emissions based on the drop in transportation, based on the drop in manufacturing, other factors as well, because COVID unfortunately caused us all to take a major pause in our lives. That's not to say we can replicate COVID, and nor do we want to, but behaviorally, the opportunity is there if we do the right things, if we invest the right ways, if we communicate the right way, and if we show what a green, climate-friendly future looks like and take those actions instead of behavior as usual, we might see the battleship turn and really head on the pathway that we're all hoping for. I think that's what I've reflected on as the opportunity of COVID, in that we now know the vision of what that looks like can now be realized. Before explaining to someone what it looked like if transportation went through a major tonal shift, how do you articulate that? Well, now we know what it looks like when the airport's 70% empty. And so being able to articulate that, demonstrate that with our communities, with our audiences, I think is now much more in front of us as a real possibility.
Interesting. And Jesse, can you just tell us how you got involved with all of this?
So probably like many incoming BU freshmen in the journalism program, I actually thought I wanted to be the next SportsCenter anchor. But over time, and through the direction of many great professors and other mentors, I focused just on the other aspects of communications. I ended up going straight into the PR field after graduation. I've worked in the PR industry for the last 20 years. About the last 12 or so, I've focused on energy efficiency and environmental action, and now climate change and sustainability. And so it's been a gradual progression for me towards this current role that I have, but certainly the desire to communicate about what people can do and really empowering those who don't necessarily have a voice is sort of the focus of why I have the role I have now. So
it's really interesting. And Eve, I don't think I asked you to share your story of how you landed where you are.
Sure, mine is not romantic at all. I graduated from BU with a journalism degree, thinking I would be the next Ira Glass and was going to go straight into podcasting on This American Life. And I got a job at WBUR as a producer on Radio Boston, the daily flagship magazine show. It's terrific people, some of the best people I've ever worked with. But I think in doing that work, I was just like, I'm missing being a reporter. I do a lot of work at a desk and I want to talk to people about how they're feeling. I want to be the one getting the story. So from there, I applied through Report for America, this amazing national program that funds journalists, mostly young emerging journalists all over the country in smaller newsrooms to kind of combat news deserts mostly. They pay for half your salary and get you into a small newsroom. I saw a job for climate change reporter, and they figured I'd recycle, I can do that. Mm-hmm. And it was a huge learning curve. And I will say my mentor at the station is a woman who has her PhD in ocean science. So she was an incredible mentor for the first 6 months. And really helped me get my feet under me because I was wildly underprepared for the concepts of climate change, I would say. And I say that, I'm honest about this because I think it's really important to say that as climate change becomes something that all of us have to think about and have to deal with, I mean, even, buying a house, we should be thinking of things that 10 years ago we maybe weren't thinking about as with climate change intersections. I think that there has to be room in the climate space for people who are not pedigree climate change people, who did not grow up loving nature. Growing up, my mom would joke that she wanted to buy an RV to go from hotel to hotel, like not to camp, just to drive to between hotels. And so that was the family I grew up in. It was not nature people. And I think that there's increasingly room for people who want to talk about climate change because they understand that it's about they're interested in justice, so they're interested in climate change. They're interested in housing, so they're interested in climate change. And that's kind of how I got here and have been able to apply what interests and skills I do have.
Yeah, it is interesting. I think as all of us experience the impacts, the extreme weather impacts that have been forecast and described with increasing accuracy by the climate scientists for years and years and years, and begin to see, property and families' health and all kinds of being affected by this. Of course, at some point we're all just going to get it, but it's interesting to think about the beginnings of that. I just want to remind everyone to please put your questions in the Q&A. We have a juicy one already for you panelists, so get ready here. This is from John Paradis. He says, what I find most frustrating is how TV meteorologists fail to get real about the climate crisis we see before us every day. happy reporting about the beautiful 80-degree day in April doesn't help. They arguably are the most important communicators because the public wants to know the weather. Some will say that their job is to report the weather and not the changes we see every day and the slow ensured degradation to our climate. I would be interested in your views on what can be done to encourage the major broadcast corporations like Sinclair and Meredith to do a much better job telling the public the truth and provide the science data that is so desperately needed. I'm just gonna, this is a pet thing for me, John. So I'm just gonna reply that I would love for you to go to Climate Central and follow them and even sign up for their program for meteorologists. What they have done over the years has been to view meteorologists, TV meteorologists as trusted messengers, just along the lines of what you're talking about, and to educate them and to really create a vibrant community of science-based, well-informed, climate-fluent TV meteorologists. We have one at our local NBC affiliate. His name is Chris Gloninger here in Boston. I don't know if anyone has seen his work. It's phenomenal. Have you, Jackie?
Yes, I have. Yes, and we've done a couple of interviews together. Well, he's interviewed me, so yeah.
That's great. And you're not in Boston, are you?
No.
Yeah, you're
no,
far.
not at all.
Yeah, so
But
he found you.
yes, he did.
Yeah, so he's really done a really great job and made a job for himself. The other guy who I would recommend you follow, he's on Twitter as Weather Prof, P-R-O-F. His name is Jeff Baradelli, and he just went to CBS in New York and has created a job for himself as the climate expert. But he started as a TV meteorologist, and so these guys are just on fire, as is the entire Climate Central group of meteorologists I have found. So Jackie, you know of their work? Or you talk.
Yeah, sure. No, I work very closely with Climate Central. In fact, we speak weekly, and we actually co-organize and administer a sea level rise certification program. It's an NAACP certification program, but Dan Rizza at Climate Central and I do it together, and we work with NOAA, FEMA, the Sea Grant program, the Society of Floodplain Managers, and so forth, to do that training.
So how would we plug into that? Would we just go to Climate Central and follow them, I suppose?
Nope, because it's really NAACP. I mean, we organize it together with the NAACP certification program. So we do it largely for our membership, although we've been talking recently about going beyond our membership potentially. But anyway, but if you came to our website, you would find it. If you email me, I can put in.
All right.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll be able to put everyone's contact information in the chat at the end or somewhere, somehow. Thank you very much. Eve or Jesse, did you want to talk at all about TV meteorologists? Or we can continue on. We have another question here. It does drive me crazy too when people say, isn't it great? It's February and it's 82 degrees.
I think, yeah, I don't, I think what I would say is just, all of us have to get better at covering climate. And I think it's like, I can't wait for the day where education reporters have a climate story coming out, and business reporters are regularly doing climate stories. So yeah, I agree. But I feel lucky that a name I was going to throw out was Eric Fisher on WBZ. I think he's terrific and is really thoughtful about climate change. So I've only, maybe it's because I cherry pick meteorologists who are talking about climate change, but my experience is watching more of that. So
there's a American Meteorology Society. Maybe we're going too far on this, and sorry, John, if we're giving you too much information, but they are a very active organization. They've had a very strong thread of climate literacy and fluency in their convenings in recent years. So I think this is getting better. So we can talk about Sinclair and Meredith maybe another time, but those are big corporations, and there are some views there that may not be amenable to the science. At least that's what I've heard from the guy in actually Albany, who's the meteorologist for the local station there that's owned by Sinclair. And he actually almost left his job over it, but somehow hammered out an agreement. to be able to talk about climate. They didn't want him to mention climate change. Jesse, unless you have something to say, I want to go on to the next, okay. NOAA, National Oceanographic, AA.
And atmospheric administration.
Thank you. NOAA is awesome on science and data, and their social channels are just teeming with interesting information if you want to follow them. Jessica McTarian, at NOAA, we like to say, if you like your 10-day weather forecast, thank an oceanographer. We need to enforce the connection between the ocean and the weather and climate. I'm a communicator at NOAA Research working in ocean observations. That's fantastic. Thank you. We have also somebody from the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, which is one of the premier conservation and I believe climate justice organizations on the ground locally that we know of, that I know of on the East Coast. AJ Metcalf says, how do you talk to workers in traditional industries affected by the proposed transition to cleaner, more sustainable industries, such as fisheries and fossil fuel workers? That's a good one. Jesse, do you want to take that?
Sure, I'll start, and I'm sure my fellow panelists have thoughts as well. The most basic answer I can say is meet them where they are. Start the conversation with what is their concern, what are they worried about, what are they addressing, what are they feeling? Don't start the conversation about climate change. If it's a fossil fuel worker in particular, that's where my head will go based on the question. Don't immediately start the conversation with oil and gas bad, drilling bad, find out what their concern is. It's, I'm sure, probably around the impact on their job. Will they have a future? Will they have an economy? There's a lot we can talk about in terms of clean energy, in renewables, in job development, in economic security for frontline communities that is based on changing the conversation around what they need for health, what they need for financial security, and what they need for electric access, grid modernization, all the things tied with that. And really, once you understand where their primary concern lies, like I said, 8 times out of 10, it's probably around their job future and their economic security. You can have a much more detailed conversation without the words global warming or climate change ever coming up. You talk to them about what's good for their future, what's good for their community's future, and what clean investment, what green investment looks like. And oftentimes it can deliver real benefit, and you can have, if not an attitudinal shift, at least an open dialogue that is respectful and considered, and come out of the conversation knowing that you educated and were educated, more importantly, by the dialogue you had. And it's really about meeting them where they are and being open to what their primary concern is first. And that's what we try and do on the ground with the communities we work in.
Try to find some common ground. And maybe there again, COVID, really brought us down to like what matters most, our loved ones, right? And our homes.
Yeah, exactly. And an example I shared when a couple of us were doing a pre-call is, we work, one of the many states is in Minnesota, and we have farmers who are primarily just concerned about the fact that their growing season is getting shorter. And not only is it getting shorter, but it's also a month earlier in the year than it used to be, 10, 20 years ago. So the conversation isn't about climate change. The conversation is about what can we do for them for water security? How can we help them with better soil management? How can we help them find ways to ensure their livelihood and their sustainability as a community, as a family, and as producers of America's food supply? And once you do that, then the climate change narrative and benefit is secondary, but still evolves down the line. So.
Jackie, I have a feeling that you've got some stories to share also. Thank you for that, Jesse, on meeting people where they are and understanding how to get to them and reach them and maybe offer them hope.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then on the other side, how to push for ssolutions.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, when I was speaking at a meeting of the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists about it a couple of years ago, and someone was asking us about our report, Cold-Blooded, Putting Profits Before People. And to Jesse's point, so once we started having that conversation, then someone from the audience raised their hand. They're like, we're from the United Mine Workers Association. And so then the conversation took a big dip at that point. Did not go well in any way. And so then we actually had to then have a kind of an offline conversation where we had to get a room to really, and we had a real 2 hour come to Jesus conversation. And the good thing about it was that we really just sat down and just talked real talk together. And that's where we really were meeting folks where they are. We had already put together, because I didn't bring up cold blooded, but someone else brought it up. So we had put together this group before called the Black Labor Initiative on Just Transition, which was comprised of folks who are on the front lines of the transitioning industries, to really have that conversation about the fact that they where they are is being at the nexus of the negative impacts of the very industries that they work in. So they're there in the communities that are being polluted, but they're also gaining a livelihood from these industries. So
Right.
that was an important place for us to start, because they were both marginalized in the conversations with labor, as labor, and they were marginalized because within our conversations around environment, they were kind of seen as on the quote unquote other side. And so when we really kind of come together and say there's just one side, us all wanting, clean air, clean water, and livelihoods, let's talk about how do we get that together. Again, rejecting the myth of scarcity and embracing the reality of abundance. And so so when we had this come to Jesus conversation, we talked about the fact that yes, whether like it or not, this industry is transitioning. And so how do we make sure that we, as the folks on the environmental advocacy, that environmental justice really takes into account the need, the broad set of needs and the realities of different folks. And so we walked away with committing to saying that when I was actually working at that time on this document on 100% building blocks towards 100% renewable energy. And so I walked away and said, we're going to make sure that one of the building blocks is workers' rights, that it's not just kind of an asterisk or like a sub bullet, but that the workers' rights is just as important as the 100% renewable ordinance or whatever, or federal or state policy. And that within that policy, it has to say that there's a jobs guarantee, a high road jobs guarantee. Because one of the things they were saying is, you just saying that I can get another job if I'm flipping burgers when I go from making this amount as in my industry, that's not really working for me. So we talked about high road careers. We talked about making sure that pensions were protected, and making sure that there's health care for the workers. One of the workers who was in that conversation was talking about how his mother has Alzheimer's, and she's dependent on the health care benefits that she gets through his deceased fathers. And so we were talking about how we make sure that we center those, and we never talk about 100% renewable without talking about pensions, without talking about healthcare, without talking about those high road jobs, that we have equal. And then they agreed that they were going to participate in the Black Labor Initiative on Just Transition, because we had invited them to it that when we first started it a couple of years before that meeting, and they didn't come. But now they have to they recognize that they can't just be kind of screaming at us across the fence, that we have to be sitting at the same table doing this conversation together in order for us to all move together on something that works. So since then, we've been able to really come up with, as you say, around solutions, ways that they're in the driver's seat, like making sure that they're at the right tables, that we're putting together a consolidated set of recommendations, that we're talking about not just jobs, but even not just so that they're kind of in the same place as they were before, but opportunities for them to be owners of businesses or vendors in the new energy economy. So they're actually having more self-determination, so that job loss isn't something that happens to them, that business ownership is something that advances them forward in terms of, even again, with the whole notion of building back better. So really actually building forward. So those are some of the things that we're working on, and some of the great advances that we're having as a result.
Pretty excited about what the new administration in the White House is up to.
Yes, pretty excited might be a stretch, but definitely encouraged and find it to be promising, and it's inspiring hope. I mean, we're very much at the table now. In fact, just today I put out this article, memo to the Biden administration. Here's what not to do on climate. I'll put it on
Yes,
the
I was
chat.
just reading that. Where did you publish that so we can get that for everyone?
It's in Reuters, Reuters Foundation, like trust.org. Anyway,
Here it is. Yeah.
I'll put the link there for everybody.
Oh, can you?
But
Okay, great. Thank you.
yeah, so while we're encouraged by the great people that are in there, the new formations that they're putting together, the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, for example, and the new positions they're creating, like the EJ position within the Department of Energy, the great people that they're bringing on board, like Deb Holland and Walea Johns and Shalonda Baker and many more than I can even name, and some of the initiatives they're putting forward, like Justice 40, we know that that we have to kind of keep at the table to make sure, because as yeah. So even the Office of Public Participation at FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, all these things are super promising, and we have to make sure that we're there to make sure that the equity measures are there throughout.
That's right.
Mhm.
That's right. Eve, anything come up for you?
No, I think that Jackie and Jesse both probably have more. This is where my role as a climate change communicator veers in a very different direction. I think that my job as a journalist, and this is something that journalists have messed up on for several years until pretty recently, is when I do stories, my job is to communicate climate change is happening already. Here's how. Here are the specific ways within our community that we're seeing water quality impacts, air quality impacts, new challenges with land scarcity and a whole number of things. So I think the two of them have probably had a lot more conversations where the job and the goal is to have that conversation where you're hearing someone out and you're listening and you're giving and you're taking and engaging on climate change, even if they're someone who doesn't necessarily, I hate this word, but believe in it, or if they're not convinced by the science of it, or they're concerned, on the other hand, the most reasonable side of it, about how some of the solutions will affect them. And I think my job is to capture how those conversations and how those tensions play out. But it's so interesting for me to hear how Jackie does it, and what Jesse said about listening, that I think that part of it I get, definitely.
Thank you. So we have two questions here, and I think we can kind of put them together a little bit. David Myers asks if Jackie can expand on the myth of scarcity versus abundance, the myth of scarcity versus abundance. And Tom O'Neill asks, I think this is related, you tell me, historically, CEOs of companies who are often wealthy and sheltered from the realities of our most vulnerable populations have had a lot of influence over policy and decision makers. So how can we relate these conversations to their reality? I would even ask, how can we communicate better with them, with those individuals who can be so influential and so helpful, and who possibly have not done everything that they possibly can to be helpful here. Recently, we've started to see a shift. This is Tom O'Neill, where companies are taking a stance. I'm thinking of the Georgia voting bill. But how do we make these efforts sustained and make real change to meet greenhouse gas emission reduction goals and healthcare access, et cetera? Who would like to take that? Because I bet a bunch, I think there's some real expertise here. Jesse?
I can address the second part of the question, but I would love for Jackie to also still further explain the myth of scarcity as well. So I'll be brief. 100% agree with Tom's point and the question as it's posed. I would say what we're seeing, and what we're seeing an increase of even before the recent Georgia activism and activity, is that an increasing number of the Forbes 500, or the global elite CEO level audiences, C-suite audiences, are becoming more and more attuned to climate change, because truthfully, most of their shareholders or most of their supply chain users are becoming more and more attuned to climate change. And so there is a real tangible difference made when the shareholder community, or when the consumer community decides that a company or a product is problematic and behavior change and takes action against it. I'm thinking of examples like the airline industry has come a long way in terms of airline emissions because so many people now are actually looking for ways to offset their own travel or just, reduce their international or domestic aviation travel. We can see demonstrations of that behavior leading to corporate supply chain and corporate behavior change at the full organizational level. That's what they listen to. They listen to the dollar, for better or for worse. And if you affect how fluently that dollar is translated, then they're going to take action to secure their environmental future. And even the oil and gas industry, as much as I'm sure most of us on this call have our opinions about their negative impact on the planet, the reason they're looking at clean energy investment is because they know it's not sustainable to continue to do what they're doing. And they know if they want to stay profitable as a company, they have to do something else. And that's because the consumers are driving them to that point. So the answer is ground level action, groundswell behavior, and it will make a tangible difference. It's slow, unfortunately, but we can do better at communicating to elevate the narrative of to why that behavior should happen.
Jackie, you want to tell us about the myth of scarcity versus abundance, please?
Yes, sure. And first, I want to also add to what Jesse said, just super briefly. One, I would say that first and foremost, we actually have to lessen the influence of corporations over decision making. We have to reverse Citizens United. We have to advance campaign finance reform. We cannot continue to kind of buckle under a corporatocracy where there's an outsized influence of these corporations over decision makers and the policies that are being made. And secondly, I would say, just to Jesse's point, we are working with groups like Ceres and the sustainable building, sustainable business group council, and so forth, to really, and most recently we spoke to the intentional endowments network, really speaking to some of the folks, and another group around shareholder, so that shareholder advocacy groups like Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, who do a lot of shareholder action. It's absolutely critical, that shareholder advocacy and education piece. And then just to the question around scarcity, yeah, the myth of scarcity. I mean, we know that this country, in some ways, we talk about notion of religious freedom and some of the myths that even are being advanced around the founding of the United States of America, and we know that when folks came here, it was this notion that the building of wealth was via exploitation, extraction, and murder of the original inhabitants of this land, then to go over and extract folks from sub-Saharan Africa to be enslaved labor here. So from there, it wasn't a notion of like there's enough to go around for everyone that we can do for ourselves. It was that we have to oppress someone else in order to have the level of riches or whatever that we want. And even as we talk about immigration policy, the U.S. is 4% of the global population, 25% of the emissions that drive climate change, driving people from their nations because it's uninhabitable, because the crops have dried up, the disasters have made their lands uninhabitable, and so they come seeking just survival, and yet we are locking people in cages and talking about replacements and saying that really with this people are taking our jobs. All of that narrative, the narrative around job killing regulations, as if we can't have jobs and livelihood and have clean air and clean water, all of that is based on the myth of scarcity. And so that's what I meant by the the myth of
You might
scarcity.
have a book in you, Jack.
Thank you. You're funny.
I really do.
Well, thank you for that. In all seriousness.
One of my very favorite subjects is now come into the Q&A. And Eve, unless you have something you're bursting to say, I'd like to just share it with everyone. Okay, so I want to know what everybody thinks. This is from Alexis Brianna Felix. How do you balance your own well-being while working on such a large, complex, and existential challenge with no easy solutions? Great question. So personally, I meditate. I am into mindfulness. I'm into eating healthy. I'm into, like, I have a little trampoline that I got during the coronavirus, and I jump on it indoors, and I get out into nature, and I stay in touch with my friends and try to take a total unplugged break every once in a while. But I'm interested in Jesse and Eve and Jackie. How do you guys balance your lives with this incredible work?
I can start. I'll say this was a question I was obsessed with for the first year of doing this work, because I would get on the phone with scientists after they would I'm in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. You probably know it. Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, Woodwell, NOAA is here. I mean, the list, you throw a rock and you hit a scientist here. And I was obsessed with this question because I would get on the phone with them and they'd say, we have a new report that says plants are no longer absorbing carbon. And I'd say, how do you possibly deal with this information? And they gave me these answers that I was like, these are wildly unsatisfying answers. The answers were kind of like, well, you know, our next study is going to be about this. And, you know, well, you just kind of put your, I don't know, I don't even remember them. They were so unsatisfying and unmemorable. And that made zero sense to me. And I wrote a whole piece about this, actually, that was published through the Ground Truth Project, because I couldn't stop thinking about it. And I think my resting place on it is that there are days where I am flooded with the realization that my stories that sometimes that, you know, that air on Cape Cod, where a lot of people already, I'm preaching to the choir sometimes about climate change. Maybe they didn't make a drop in the bucket today. Maybe they made no drop in the bucket at all, ever. And sometimes you just sit with that and you're just like, but this problem is so big. And then there are days, and then I sit with it, and that's the day, and it really sucks. And then there are days where I feel like, you know, there are little tiny solaces. There are little moments. I have this one wonderful source who's a 17-year-old in Sandwich, Massachusetts, who's a climate advocate, activist, and he's even working on legislation to get climate justice and climate change in every class, K through 12. And they filed this bill in the state of Massachusetts. And he said he was partially inspired by the stories that I was putting out. He felt like they were manageable. They were understandable to him as a 16-year-old living on Cape Cod, wanting to understand climate change and how it was shaping and being shaped by our local regulators and community members. And it's moments like that where you're like, the work that we are doing, that collective work, Jesse, Jackie, like whatever network, whatever web of people we reach through our work, cumulatively does something. It does start making those individual changes where consumers say, hey, I'm not going to buy, you know, shampoo anymore in a bottle. I'm going to buy it in a bar because I'm not comfortable with that anymore. I mean, that's very specific, maybe too specific to me, but I think that I know that those kinds of changes are happening when we work collectively. And that kind of helps pull me out of it, at least.
Okay, we can have lightning round. We have only,
I know, I'm sorry,
seconds left. No, that's great. Jesse or Jackie, you want to chime in?
Yeah, I'll just say super briefly that similarly, the stories, being in touch with the communities where they're starting to push on the changes that we need, that's what inspires me. Also, whenever I can, I'm by the water. That keeps me going. That for me is healing. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, and you know, I've sat in the negotiating halls of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, where the Paris Agreement was hashed out, but most other years is a 2-week slog of just, you know, hurdle after hurdle after hurdle. So I totally get it. But the stories, like both Jackie and Eve have said, and honestly, the truth is, I now have a 3-year-old daughter. I have a reason to keep going and keep fighting and protect her future and the future of her friends and others. And that's all I have to look at to remind me what I'm doing. So, yeah.
Oh my God, I cannot think of a better note to end on. So I want to thank you all so much. I think we could go on, and I wish we could, but we can't. We, I think, are going to give an announcement about the next COMTalk, but this has been exceptional. So thank you all so very much. Yeah, so on Wednesday, May 12th, which will be here before we know it, so mark your calendars for The Art of Freelance, a conversation of how to launch your brand, 3 to 4 p.m. And you can see just how to do it right there on that slide. Jessica asks if some resources can be shared out from the panelists, and absolutely, I'm sure that we can get that figured out in the next few days. And thank you all so much for participating and for being here. Bye for now.
Thank you all.